By the 20th century, competition on the North Atlantic was a frenzy. The previous century had seen significant advances during what would later become known as the Industrial Revolution, and it ushered forth an era of ocean travel thought previously impossible. A single crossing of the vast ocean was now down to only a few days. Decades before, it would have taken weeks, if not months. This fierce competition on the Atlantic had attracted the services of many major shipping lines. The two most significant and most successful were the Cunard Line and, of course, the White Star Line. However, the story of Hull 401 begins in 1897 with the debut of new German-made ships on the Atlantic route. They were large, luxurious, and most impressively, fast. These new ships took an enormous amount of travel and paying customers away from the Cunard and White Star lines, and each began plans that would, in their minds, trump the German ships and hand supremacy of the Atlantic back over into British hands. White Star answered with the Oceanic in 1899, and while famous, she wasn't enough to recoup the throngs of paying passengers back to her owners from the German ships. Shortly after the debut of the Oceanic, the owner of the White Star Line, Thomas Ismay, died at the age of 62. Control of the company passed on to his son, Joseph Bruce Ismay, or Bruce for short. In 1899 and the year following, Cunard answered the German competition with Ivernia and Saxonia. These two ships were enough to capture the attention of the public for some time, but they still were not enough to satisfy the ship's owners. So both Cunard and White Star went back to their proverbial drawing boards and began planning their next set of ocean liners. White Star launched the Celtic into service in 1901, and at just under 21,000 gross registered tons, she was the largest ship in the world at the time. She held a special place in White Star owner Bruce Ismay's eyes, as it was the last ship his father had a hand in planning. Bruce had seen to it that Celtic would be the first of her class, which would total 4 ships. Realizing that the company couldn't survive simply on the success of one ship, he wanted to leapfrog over both the German and Cunard lines in one swoop. The ships that followed in the Celtic's class were named Baltic, Cedric, and Adriatic. They proved to be very popular and began to re-establish White Star as a premier shipping line. The Big Four were also extremely economical for their time, taking only 200 tons of coal per day to operate, compared to other vessels that would typically consume 600 tons. This made the cost to run them very low, which further increased the profits for White Star. However, for all of Ismay's genius in planning these remarkable vessels and the grandeur they contained, they couldn't keep up in the speed category as they only barely met the minimum requirements from the British government to obtain the title RMS, Royal Mail Steamer. During all this time of White Star's attempts of recapturing the Atlantic waves for herself, the Cunard Line had something truly gargantuan brewing in their planning offices. Beginning in 1901, they started drawing plans for 2 new ships, each 700 feet in length. The British government funded the construction of the vessels and designated that their speed reaches an unfathomable 24 knots. Cunard had answered the German liners in kind, and with the launch of each claiming to be the world's largest ships, the eyes of the British public and the entire globe were centered squarely on these 2 Goliaths, Lusitania and Mauretania. Bruce Ismay and the owner of the Harland and Wolff shipyard, Lord William Peary, needed to match or better these 2 new ships to regain the popularity of the public, and so they set about conceiving their plans. The legend is so often told that they hatched their ideas at a dinner party at Peary's house in 1907 after having been taken off guard by the launch of these new superliners, but history paints a different picture. With the success of the Big Four, Ismay was looking to translate it into a new class of liner, an evolution upon what had already been established to be a huge success. Take whatever worked and was liked about their 4 queens, and translate that into 2 new ships that would improve upon those ideas even further. Lord Peary began with a set of preliminary sketches and plans, and it was up to Bruce to decide which to use. He settled on Plan D. From there, Peary would hand the design over to Alexander Montgomery Carlyle, who would further expand upon the ideas from Ismay. Finally, an agreed-upon plan was handed over to Ismay for final approval, which carried out very quickly. 2 new ships, with an option for a third, to be built by Harland and Wolff at their usual rate, cost plus 4%. Something extraordinary began to take shape in the shipping town of Belfast, Ireland. Harland and Wolff were tearing up their slipways, long stretches of land where ships were built and subsequently launched. 3 of these large slipways converted into 2, and just down the river was the location of a new, breathtakingly sizable dry dock. White Star had initiated the chain of events which would lead to 2 brand new liners, the likes of which the world had never seen. On Wednesday, December 16th, 1908, the first section of the keel laid for the first vessel, Harland and Wolff, yard number 400. The second ship's construction followed quickly after, on Wednesday, March 31st, 1909, with the designation number 401. These 2 vessels were to impress upon the public the size, strength, and grandeur that their owners intended. Lusitania and Mauretania were named after wealthy ancient Roman provinces. Hull numbers 400 and 401 would follow suit, taking names from ancient Greek god archetypes. The dimensions and details of the ships were to usher in a new age of ocean liners, which just 2 years before had already begun. At nearly 883 feet in length, 92.5 feet in width, and a weight of over 50,000 tons, they would dwarf any other ship in the world, being already 33% larger than the new Lusitania and Mauretania. White Star stipulated one more thing for these 2 new massive ships. They must achieve a speed of 21 knots to remain competitive with other ocean liners. Harland and Wolff now had to rise to the occasion and breathe life into these Grecian behemoths. As the years 1909 and 1910 passed by, the hulls of 400 and 401 began to take shape, first with ribs and then with shell plating. The ships dwarfed every other structure in Belfast easily. Every day, an estimated 15,000 workers toiled away to produce the vessels. The only day given for rest was Sunday. Otherwise, the yard was booming with activity from 6 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. with a 30-minute lunch break. Saturdays counted as a half day, and workers left at noon. Bathroom breaks were limited to just 7 minutes per worker per day, with a timekeeper outside the bathroom door. With so many workers at hand, White Star relied on its best men to oversee the construction. Alexander Carlyle was the brother-in-law of Lord Peary and held the title of chairman of the managing directors. Carlyle was in charge of overseeing virtually every aspect of the ship's planning and construction. However, on June 30th, 1910, he retired, leaving a void that needed to be filled at the company. Peary filled it with another of his rising stars and a pure genius in the shipbuilding world, Thomas Andrews Jr., his nephew. Andrews had made a name for himself at Harland and Wolff in 1889 by starting as a premium apprentice at the young age of 16. During that time, it was said that he never wasted a moment and certainly never expected to be given special treatment because his uncle owned the company. After working for a little over a decade, he had risen to assistant shipyard manager and was heavily involved with the construction of the Big Four. It seemed a natural fit for him to be Carlyle's replacement in 1910. By April 6, 1910, all of 401's frames were now in place inside the gantry at Harland and Wolff. Shell plating installation began immediately after, with each piece of shell plating measuring approximately 10 feet tall, 20 feet wide, and 1 inch thick. The workers at Harland and Wolff had a long road ahead of them. Day in and day out, they beat rivets in with their hammers 5.5 days a week, nearly 12 hours each day. The rivets were installed via hydraulic machines in the center portions, but due to the curvatures, the bow and stern sections had to carry out by hand. In total, 3 million of them would be used to hold each ship together. Work continued on Hull 401 until October 19, 1910. Hull 400 had been scheduled for her launching ceremony the next day, and the shipyard and Belfast were abuzz about the new creation. The event, attended by thousands, proved to be a remarkable success. As Olympic was towed to her fitting-out basin, work would resume on Hull 401 so that she could meet her launch date, scheduled 7 months later. It would take the laborers at Harland and Wolff 2 years and 2 days since the laying of her keel. Finally, the morning of May 31st, 1911 dawned, and Hull 401 was now ready to launch. The weather was as perfect as could be asked for, with a slight breeze. 21 tons of soap had been spread along the slipway to ease the massive structure into the river. One by one, the timbers underneath the hull were knocked out, allowing the ship to sit squarely on the ways under her weight for the first time. She remained in place by 2 hydraulic launch triggers. Bruce Ismay and Lord Peary took a stroll along the ship's hull, the last-minute inspection that all was ready. As the clock wound down to the exciting moment of launch, the crowds had grown to an estimated 100,000 onlookers, each eager to get a glimpse of the new White Star liner. At 12:13 p.m., the triggers were released and Hull 401 began to slide back gently. Slow at first, but picking up speed, it took just 62 seconds for the massive 26,000-ton hull to clear the slipway. Titanic had taken to the waters for the very first time. In the coming months, work would needed to be done to complete her interiors and turn her into the most luxurious liner yet witnessed. It would be almost a year before she was ready to take to the open ocean. White Star, Harland and Wolff, and the rest of the world were anxious to see the day when Titanic set sail.